Joining me, Hannah Story Brown. She is a writer and researcher with the Revolving Door Project. Hannah, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's talk about the Willow Project. What exactly is it? How long has it been in the works?
So, the Willow Project, it's interesting to think about that kind of question because ConocoPhillips, the Texas-based oil company that is proposing this project, has actually held leases in the Alaskan North Slope, this sort of Arctic wilderness area, for decades now, since the 90s. But under the Trump administration, they proposed what was called the Willow Project, what is called the Willow Project. And the Trump administration approved it, kind of just the way that ConocoPhillips wanted it. But environmental groups sued and successfully got that sort of sent back to the drawing board under the understanding that the environmental reviews performed under the Trump administration were insufficient and didn't fully account for this oil drilling project's enormous costs. So it's been a litigation battle for a number of years now. And about 2 weeks ago, Biden's Interior Department went ahead with approving a somewhat scaled down, but still, largely quite significant drilling project in the Arctic that would still allow ConocoPhillips to produce over 500 million barrels of oil. And it's about 92% of the oil that they had initially sought to drill under the Trump administration.
Okay, and so just to be clear, they had the leases, but they need to basically make a proposal. This is how we intend to exploit these leases, and that is subject to an EPA review that says that does a cost benefit analysis that includes the cost to our environment and to the potential dangers that are associated with it. Is that basically it?
More or less, yeah. So, the Interior Department and several of its subdivisions, including the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, are all involved in those reviews and that analysis process that you're talking about. The EPA also weighs in. So I would say, I hope that answers that part of the question.
No, that does. And so where were we on this process? People, I think it's quite clear. The amount of carbon is worth something like almost 2 million more cars, as if we were to put 2 million more gas cars on the road than we had planned to do. There's, obviously a big move to electric cars. We're setting that back by years and years. Like you say, 239 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. That is the equivalent of 64 new coal plants operating for a year, or again, like almost 2 million new cars. Before we get into the all of the potentials of what it means to put these roads in that area, what it means to develop the Arctic in a way that is exclusively industrial, and the potential dangers of leaks and methane leaks, et cetera, et cetera. What was the status of these reviews? It was the court found that the Trump administration couldn't do it because they did an insufficient EPA review. Where was that within the context of the Biden administration? Had those reviews been done? Could there theoretically be another suit saying you didn't finish those reviews?
So these are really great questions. What came out when the Interior Department approved this project, they put out a final supplemental environmental impact statement, which attempted to address some of the issues that environmental groups previously raised in those lawsuits where they succeeded in getting it remanded back to the agency for further review. These are, hundreds of pages of really technical information, and yet it didn't necessarily still take into account all of the cumulative and individual costs, as well as we can measure them, of this project. And in fact, within 48 hours of the Interior Department filing this approval of one of the different versions of the project that they had considered. So, this environmental impact statement, it provides a bunch of different potential plans for drilling. One of those plans was no drilling. And environmental groups have sued again in the Alaskan District Court, saying that, among other things, the government didn't actually consider that as a viable alternative. And yet, under law, the Interior Department has significant authority and discretion to deny permits for drilling on federal lands. And this is something that the Biden administration has not really been open about acknowledging, that there are obligations to consider by the Secretary of the Interior how to protect what they call the surface resources of the Arctic, because of course these laws are more interested in what's below the surface, all the oil in the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. But as we all know, the Arctic has incredible, important biodiversity, permafrost that we don't want to melt, endangered species like polar bears, whales, caribou. There's a lot there that the government is under law obliged to consider, and it has the authority to deny projects on the grounds that they would have significant deleterious impacts on those other valuable parts of the ecosystem and of the country's resources.
So in other words, you can consider both the sort of like global impact of what's being taken out of the ground, and then you can also consider the impact of the act of taking it out of the ground, all the roads that are there. In fact, at one point, I think you write ConocoPhillips will have to bring in coolers to refreeze the melting permafrost in order to drill for that oil, which ironically then when combusted will further melt the permafrost. You even talk about the fact that it's quite possible that they may end up just like sort of abandoning all of their the infrastructure that they create there and all of the machines, because at one point it could be impossible for them to pass through and get this stuff, because the Arctic the permafrost there may melt. The irony of the fact that there is a lawsuit against this and that it was stopped initially by a lawsuit is that the Biden administration and Biden himself, just the other day actually, said, and this is, he's got to try and justify the fact that he had already said no new drilling on federal lands. I mean, he said that in his campaign. He claimed that he was inclined to reject it, but he was told by his lawyers, we'll get sued. But they're getting sued anyways. Like, what? How do you? Is there any? What's the most positive? What's the most charitable perspective you can take on that? Is there one? Like, I don't know how you square that.
I think the most charitable perspective you can offer is, in fact, it is a real problem that major corporations they have such deep pockets, they have big law lawyers, they are like so equipped to challenge the federal government. And the courts are, increasingly sort of emboldened by these bizarre right-wing legal doctrines that really hold no water. We see that the administration is indeed up against unfriendly courts and powerful corporations, but that doesn't mean that it gets to dismiss its obligation to serve the public interest and to refuse to pick a fight against the corporations that are imperiling, like literally, our habitable planet. I can't really think of a better, villain for the Biden administration to take on. And they kind of just admitted that they were scared.
Well, I want to talk about the political aspect of it in a moment, but it just seems to me like I can understand saying, well, we don't want to expend our resources on fighting this in court, but you're going to be fighting it in court. You're fighting it in court now. And the question is like, which side do you want to be fighting on? Which takes us to the politics of it. In the run up to the Willow Project, all three, I guess, of the sort of the lawmakers from federal lawmakers from Alaska came out, both the senators from Alaska and the Democratic Congresswoman who was elected Peltola, Peltola, and they're in favor of the project. if you were to not really dig too deeply, you would hear stories of native folk, in and around Alaska, and Alaskans being in favor of it, ostensibly because there's going to be jobs. But you made a good point in your piece, like the amount of jobs, like the federal government wants to step in and create these jobs. You could have people just digging ditches, and it would be a blip in the federal budget, certainly less than what they're going to end up paying for like remediating the impact of climate change, right? I mean, outline what you can tell were the politics associated with this, and then we can layer in the idea of like what Joe Biden's doing to himself, politically in this instance.
Yeah, those are great questions. And there's so much there. I mean, first of all, we use these sort of, not we, folks use these economic justifications to say, we're dependent on oil. We've been historically dependent on oil. And that is something we need to confront, because we don't want people to be left behind by the inevitable energy transition that we're going to be facing. So, rational, forward-thinking policymaking is going to have to actually reckon with the fact that, yes, Alaska needs economic support. People need to be taken care of. Jobs need to be created. We need to carry everyone with us. And so I think that is what I would have wished the Biden administration would say. And in terms of the impact on Indigenous folks, Indigenous people are obviously not a monolith. I'm not going to pretend that I can speak for anyone. But I do think it's important to recognize also that the Inupiat folks in Nuiqsut, Alaska, who are the community most directly impacted by this infrastructure, a lot of them have voiced really explicit concerns about the impacts that it would have on them, whether that's increased pollution, increased noise, the possibility of oil spills. They already are surrounded by ConocoPhillips infrastructure, and they've already faced gas leaks in their community from malfunctioning oil and gas infrastructure. So there's also those voices to take into account.
What of the supposed trade-offs? There were other leases that Conoco sort of traded back. We agree not to use these leases if you let us do this massive project. I mean, my jaded perspective on that is if they have leases that are unused, it's because they don't think they're valuable. And they're giving back things that they would have never exploited in the first place. Am I wrong about that?
I think that's a pretty apt read.
I guess the frustrating thing about, not engaging legally in this instance is the willingness for Conoco investors, for across the board, to invest in a project of this size 10 years from now, maybe even 5 years from now, is going to be much less, because we're going to be further down the road to making this transition. And so a legal strategy that was just built upon drag this out would in fact have a lot of potential to stop this whole thing, right? I mean, that's sort of what we saw with Keystone XL. It just became more and more costly as things dragged on, and it was the denial of this permit was almost like at that point sort of a fait accompli. It didn't really matter as much. Was that potentially the dynamic here? I mean, it's so frustrating and angering that the Biden administration chose this path as opposed to another.
Yeah, especially because you're absolutely right that if the administration had chosen to, reject this specific proposal, not even to say, we reject any proposal no matter what for drilling in this specific area going forward, but just to say, this one we have significant concerns about, we can't approve it. If that process had continued to be mired in delay, which, the government has the absolute authority to do, we would hope that, in years to come, this would become a lot less economically viable for the company, and it would sort of solve itself in that way. I actually feel like worth pointing out is that just today, the Biden administration is auctioning off 73 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico. It was obliged by the Inflation Reduction Act to hold some sort of lease sale for those waters, but it was not obliged to hold a lease sale for that many acres, like almost the total unleased area in the Gulf of Mexico. So I think just pointing out that the Biden administration does not have to go all the way and saying, yes, fossil fuel infrastructure, like we're going to just open it up. They can, they can hedge, they can delay, they can like hold these projects to a higher standard. And in so doing, help sort of create the time that we need to get renewable energy to take over that and to make these not even like the illusion of financially viable for these fossil fuel companies.
I mean, it's interesting. I was just watching the Howard Schultz testimony in front of the Help Committee, and one of the things that Starbucks has been doing is they've just been doing delay tactics on negotiating contracts. They say like, oh, we don't want to have Zoom meetings. Everybody's got to show up at this time at this place for the negotiations, which of course is ridiculous in this day and age. You're not going to have Zoom meetings. And then they cancel. And it's really just, we're just going to delay, because when you don't have the power, you delay and you wait for things to change. The administration could be doing this on many, many fronts. They don't necessarily have to be out there and being performative as these, great environmentalists are caring that much about it. They could very bureaucratically slow the wheels here, and just wait it out as much as possible. And they're refusing to do that. How much is and there's talk about this across the administration. Maybe this is not something but one of the reasons why I wanted someone from the Revolving Door Project is because I think a lot of this is just sort of like really corporate interests, obviously. How much of this do you think, and there's no way to prove this, right? But does the having Ron Klain no longer the chief of staff, and this guy Jeff Zients, who is about as corporatist as it gets, and I've also heard, frankly, not that competent. How much of it is a function of this new chief of staff coming in and really sort of like deciding who's going to get to Biden and what their perspective is going to be at any given time?
It's a really good point. People talk about the chief of staff as the gatekeeper to the president. They decide whose voices get heard. And Ron Klain was known as someone who was able to, juggle progressive and moderate flanks within the party, make both parties' voices heard. And Jeff Zients, in contrast, doesn't have that sort of political acumen. He's been called a businessman's businessman. He was in the Obama administration very explicitly the sort of business liaison for the administration. And so we see him come into Biden's White House at a time when Biden is definitely taking more pro-corporate stances and sort of making his reputation as, Union Joe, pro-worker Joe, want to build the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. It's really muddling the coherence of that legacy. And I worry that Jeff Zients in the White House is going to make it more of an uphill battle for folks to combat corporations having Biden's ear and to get other voices in the mix.
Well, Hannah Story Brown, writer, researcher at the Revolving Door Project, we'll put a link to your email newsletter, which covered this and sort of the climate crisis's impact on the Silicon Valley Bank collapse the other week. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.